In the early morning hours of October 6, 1915, the residents of Nortonville, Kentucky were jolted awake by a large explosion. The blast had occurred in the very heart of this small, quiet mining town and claimed the life of at least one innocent man, a very young man who was simply trying to build a better life for himself and his family by working in the Nortonville coal mines. But what led up to this tragic moment, and what would happen to those who perpetrated the crime? To find those answers, let's dive deeper into this interesting case. To understand this case, you first have to understand the climate of the time. In the early 1900s, vigilante groups were on the rise in western Kentucky, largely due to the Black Patch War that occurred in Kentucky and Tennessee from around 1904 to 1909. The so-called Tobacco War started out as a conflict between the American Tobacco Company, which was the largest tobacco monopoly at the time, and the Dark Tobacco District Planters Protective Association, or the PPA for short, because that's a mouthful of a name. Local farmers and business leaders started the PPA to combat the influence of the American Tobacco Company. So, of course, the American Tobacco Company wasn't thrilled with the PPA. The PPA originally just wanted to withhold tobacco until the company paid a fair price for the product. But when economic pressures failed, many farmers resorted to raids and vigilante violence. These farmers formed brigades of what they called night riders, and they would ride around and vandalize property and destroy crops of farmers that cooperated with the American Tobacco Company. Of course, this led supporters of the tobacco company on the other side to attack those suspected of carrying out these raids, and the violence unfortunately spiraled out of control for a while sporadically in western Kentucky and western Tennessee. One branch of this group of raiders was called the Possum Hunters that Ride by Night. Again, a mouthful of a name, so we'll just call them Possum Hunters, which is how most folks referred to them at the time anyway. And even after the tensions of the Black Patch War had subsided, several of these vigilante groups, including the Possum Hunters, persisted and would pop up every now and then. While no longer really being about tobacco, the focus of these vigilantes shifted to more coal mining related issues. For example, pro-union sympathizers might use night rider tactics to put pressure on non-union members, and vice versa. Also, some night riders or possum hunters used the anonymity of their disguises and nighttime raids to threaten people that they didn't agree with, or who they felt weren't living right or weren't following the proper rules or decorum of society. There were several cases of men here in Hopkins County being dragged from their homes and beaten in the middle of the night. One such attack was on a prominent businessman and farmer named Solonis Franklin Cates. Cates lived 4 miles south of White Plains, and one night in June 1915, he was taken from his home and severely beaten. He was then told to leave his home and all of his property, including 4 mines that he owned, and to never return. By 1920, he and his family had indeed left town and were living in Illinois. According to the February 25, 1915 edition of the Hopkinsville Kentuckian, even churches couldn't escape the reach of the possum hunters. One Sunday evening here in Nortonville, the Mount Carmel Church had its evening services interrupted when 50 armed men entered their sanctuary. The unknown leader of the group asked the minister for permission to address the crowd, which, of course, the minister promptly gave since he was at gunpoint, and the possum hunter told the congregation to quit, quote, smoking, drinking, selling whiskey, gambling, and to quit shooting at a church in the neighborhood, end quote. Following this warning, the leader then said that no one should leave the church for at least 30 minutes because it wasn't safe for them outside. The possum hunters then left, and the minister resumed and finished his sermon. Night rider targets were also sometimes racially motivated. Throughout this era, there were several threats against the African American miners here at Nortonville. At one point, there were so many threats that Sterling Lanier, the vice president and manager of the Norton Coal Mining Company, hired extra security guards to protect the mine and its workers. He also installed a high-powered searchlight to constantly scan the area around the mine and the nearby African American boarding house each night. The threats against African American miners ramped up again in the summer and into the fall of 1915. Several Nortonville miners received anonymous notes at their homes telling them to leave town or face the consequences. A few days before the event we had talked about at the beginning of this video, a black miner named Charlie Day had received one of these notes. The author claimed that Charlie was bootlegging whiskey and keeping a disorderly house, and that he should leave town or something bad would happen to him. Charlie took the threat seriously and moved out and left town on October 4th. The cabin in question was owned by the Norton Coal Mining Company. It was located in the heart of town, likely in the area near the train depot and hotel, which were also fairly close to the number 1 mine, and was part of a mining camp full of homes owned by the mines and rented out to its miners. Having enough housing was often a problem in our early coal towns. Lots of opportunities and jobs sometimes sprang up overnight as the mines expanded, but there were often not enough homes for workers, so coal companies would set up a bunch of small, quickly built cabin-like structures for one or more families or groups of men to live in. In this case, the home looked like it could house, 2 families or multiple miners. Oftentimes, men would come to town alone looking for opportunities and would bring their families in later or send money back home to help their families. It sounds as though father and son, Tom and Will Cattron, moved into the small cabin on Tuesday, October 5th, just after Charlie Day had hastily vacated the premises the day before. It's not quite clear if the father and son knew about the previous threats against its former occupant. In addition to the Cattrons, the home was also occupied by at least 2 other African American miners named Will Perdue and James Williams. All 4 men were employed by the Norton Coal Company. In the early morning hours of Wednesday, October 6, 1915, at around 2 a.m., dynamite was ignited under the cabin while all 4 innocent men slept. The sound of the blast was impressive, according to eyewitnesses, and woke many residents from deep slumbers and could be heard from miles away. The explosion ripped a giant hole through the small structure, doing a considerable amount of damage, and killing 20-year-old Will Cattron instantly. This is a photo of the actual scene just after the event. Now, this is where the facts of the case and how many men actually died due to the explosion get a little hazy. Unfortunately, the lives of many of these men at the time were pretty transient, and records weren't always the best kept at the time, especially for the black miners. And newspaper articles report, differing facts concerning the case. One said that Will Cattron was the only one that died, while another said that Perdue and Williams also died. One account has Perdue as a guest of the Cattrons, staying with him temporarily, while others have him living in the home and working in the mines as well. One initial report had Will Cattron and 2 of his small children injured in the explosion, but I've never seen any other evidence that suggested Will's children were there at the time. It sounds more like he and his dad were working in the mines and living in the mining camp, while the rest of the family was elsewhere. Also, just the Cattron name was often misspelled, not having one uniform, way of doing it. So again, the newspaper reports were kind of all over the place. Just from reading all of the newspaper accounts that I could find and weighing the totality of the evidence at hand, I have a feeling that 2 men, Will Cattron and Will Perdue or Pardue, likely died as a result of this crime, but we only have absolute evidence for the murder of Cattron. Here we see Cattron's death certificate, issued and signed by Dr. Thomas Howell here in Hopkins County. The information on the Cattron certificate was provided by local miner Hezekiah Boyd. Aside from the information listed here on the death certificate, we know next to nothing about poor Will Cattron, which is incredibly sad. It says here that he was buried at Nortonville Cemetery, which at the time often referred to New Salem, but there was also a black cemetery north of town, so it could refer to that as well. So yeah, we're not even sure where the poor man is buried. For the second possible victim in this crime, we have a man named Will Perdue. After searching extensively through records for Mr. Perdue and coming to so many dead ends and getting so frustrated and pretty much exasperated with this case, I finally came across an interesting death record from Montgomery County, Tennessee at this time. A 39-year-old miner named William Parker Pardue died on October 24th of a severe brain concussion. The doctor who filled out the certificate said that Pardue had suffered from the injury about 19 days before, which, matched up with the same time of the Nortonville explosion. Now, it's kind of odd that the doctor wouldn't have put a secondary cause of death here, referencing the explosion. But according to newspaper reports, it sounds like everyone involved thought that Mr. Pardue was so fatally wounded that they decided to send him home to his family in Tennessee so that he could die in peace with those that cared about him. So I guess it wouldn't be too odd if the doctor in Tennessee wasn't completely, up on the details of the case and didn't bother to put in a secondary, reason. But because the crime isn't directly referenced on the death certificate, I can't say 100% that this is the same man that was injured in the Nortonville explosion. But for me personally, the circumstantial evidence is pretty strong that Pardue was the second victim of the crime. In the days following the explosion, there was a lot of outrage here in Hopkins County that completely innocent men were killed in their sleep. I think because of past attacks, a lot of law enforcement here were just done with the whole Night Rider vigilante thing. The sheriff at the time, Sheriff Tom Logan, immediately called in bloodhounds from a neighboring county and early the next morning tracked the guilty parties for a time, but unfortunately lost the trail. Multiple horse tracks were found, which led them to believe it was more than one guilty party. That same day, local circuit judge John Fleming Gordon declared war against all night riders and said that he would see that justice reached these criminals responsible for this heinous act, even if he had to go out and find them himself. The crime attracted the attention of leaders across the county and state, and it put a big spotlight and pressure on local vigilante groups and seemed to quell the violence for a time. Kentucky Governor James McCreary offered a $400 reward for the arrest of whoever murdered the two African-American miners. Hopkins County and the Norton Coal Mining Company, where the men worked, also offered large rewards for any information leading to an arrest in the case. About a week later, on Thursday, October 14, 1915, Nortonville residents were surprised when two local men were arrested for the crime. Marbury Ferguson and Newton Jasper Wilburn, both coal miners living here in Nortonville at the time, were arrested for willful murder and taken to the Hopkins County Jail. They were both also charged with discharging dynamite under a dwelling, and Wilburn received an additional charge of assault and battery, since following his arrest he reportedly struck Nortonville Marshal Sam Woodward in the face. As the sheriff and his deputy were walking Wilburn to the Nortonville depot following his arrest on the 14th, they said they were approached by the Nortonville Marshal, and that Wilburn, unprovoked and without saying a word, punched the marshal in the face, giving him a large gash under his eye. Wilburn, however, later said that Woodward taunted him as he walked by, and he simply lashed out in anger at the taunt, which I can't say I'm surprised, since Woodward probably made a comment that made him mad because he was known for that sort of thing. Justice moved fairly swiftly in this case, and the trial against Marbury Ferguson for willful murder began a few months later on February 22, 1916. Wilburn asked for a separate trial, so his day in court would come later. During the trial, witnesses testified that on the night of the explosion, they heard Ferguson tell several African Americans to be careful or leave town as, quote, some of them might be blown to hell that evening, end quote. A man named L. Quinn Moore testified that he had seen Ferguson the day before the crime while they were both in Madisonville, and stated that the defendant told him that something was to be done about the cabin the next day. Marshal Woodward recounted the Charlie Day story while on the stand, and also said that Ferguson and most everyone knew that Day had moved out. Multiple witnesses and Ferguson himself also stated that he was incredibly drunk that night just before the explosion and was in a good humor. Marbury Ferguson continued to stick to his story throughout the trial and cross-examination, and his main defense was that he was indeed incredibly drunk that evening and far too impaired to commit the crime. His son Gilbert corroborated this by stating that he physically had to help his father home, carrying him part of the way, at around 11 p.m. that evening. N.J. Wilburn testified that he saw the son struggling with the father, so he helped him carry him home. Ferguson's daughter testified that she slept in the same room as her father and that he was sound asleep throughout the entire night. The explosion didn't even wake him up, even though it woke pretty much everybody else up in town. On February 25, 1916, Marbury Ferguson was found not guilty after 15 minutes of deliberation. As soon as Ferguson's verdict was announced, it was also announced that the charges against N.J. Wilburn would also be dropped, with the option of filing charges later. At first, I was kind of horrified that both of these men might have gotten away with murder, but after looking at the facts of the case, it's likely the jury made the only decision they could make under the circumstances and with the charges given to them. In the end, drunkenness was likely what, caused Marbury Ferguson to brag a little bit on, put out some information that he happened to have about the cabin. I don't know if he heard that at work or actually knew who did it, but the fact that he was so drunk and spoke so freely was kind of his best defense. The prosecution's own witnesses had seen Ferguson not long before the attack and said he was ridiculously impaired. So clearly Ferguson knew what was going to happen to the cabin, but then nothing said that he actually did it. In fact, someone so ridiculously drunk and impaired to the point that, Ferguson was, probably would have blown himself up if he tried to, commit that kind of crime. So in the end, he knew about it, but didn't directly do it. Therefore, the jury had to let him go. The real question here for me is the innocence or guilt of N.J. Wilburn. You see, there's a very interesting backstory for Mr. Wilburn that makes me question whether or not he could have been involved in such a crime. You see, Newton Jasper Wilburn was actually Captain Wilburn of the Kentucky Guard, who, according to one Hopkinsville newspaper, will always be remembered as, quote, one of the bravest soldiers encamped here during the night rider troubles, end quote. The Mayfield Messenger in May 1908 described Wilburn as, quote, one of the most fearless of the state guards for his daring raids with local law enforcement to root out the lawless night riders. Captain Wilburn, or Lieutenant Wilburn at the time, was known for being courageous and bold on these raids and going after night riders all across western Kentucky, but particularly in the Paducah and Hopkinsville areas. He clearly had no sympathies for the riders or any unlawful behavior that threatened the peace in the western part of our state, and those that rode with him thought highly of him. He had signed up with the National Guard at age 18, likely wanting to serve like his father did for the Union during the Civil War. After leaving the Guard, he began working as a coal miner, first in Union County, and later coming to Nortonville to work for the Norton Coal Company. In fact, even after being accused of murder, he remained here in Nortonville until the early 1920s with his wife and 4 children. So something tells me he was the kind of guy that didn't run when people accused him of things. He seemed like a proud man. And for some reason, I could see that as being the reason he might have assaulted Marshall Woodward here at Nortonville, if you remember, at the train station, after he was arrested. He was a proud man defending his honor. So overall, I just have a really hard time believing Wilburn had anything to do with dynamiting the miners' cabin here in Nortonville. It seems like a stretch that a young man that had distinguished himself against vigilantes would suddenly turn into one just a few years later. And the only real, connection that connected him to the case was the fact that he happened to help Marbury Ferguson home that night. That was it. That was the only connection I could find. He was a good Samaritan helping an impaired man home. Now, there may have been more to it, but I couldn't find it. I even wrote to the state archives, but there wasn't much left in the file, especially since it was a not guilty verdict. And there was just no more evidence against either man listed there. So, as with so many of these cases, the truth of whether Newton Jasper Wilburn was involved or not died with him on January 31st, 1927, when he passed away at the age of 52. At the time, he was living in Muhlenberg County and working as a postmaster. Oddly enough, Wilburn died of complications from a bad fall, and years later, in 1936, his co-defendant Marbury Ferguson also died from a rough fall, breaking his neck when he fell from a wagon. Just an interesting little historical footnote there. At the end of the day, justice was denied in this case, and no one was ever charged with the crime. The murders of Will Cattron and possibly William Parker Pardue remain unsolved. Well, that's it for this video. Had you heard of this crime before? Did you know there was a deadly explosion here in Nortonville back in the day? There was actually another similar explosion in the 1930s, but thankfully I don't think anyone died in that one. But we may talk about that one someday too. When we post this video on Facebook, let us know if you think either man could have committed this crime and what your thoughts are on the case. We'd love to hear your feedback. Also, be sure to subscribe to this channel so you never miss out on our local history videos. Thanks again for watching, and we hope to see you soon at the Nortonville Museum.